years, there is a lot of pruning, sort of trimming the hedges kind of, that your brain does, and that's normal. And maybe that process is going awry somehow. Maybe Edward Scissorhands is getting kind of crazy and he's kind of cutting down to the quick, and there's the nerve cells are getting kind of hacked back when they shouldn't be. Because that might explain too why it's kicking in at that age, at that young age. In essence, though, I mean, we don't know what, we have those theories, but we don't know why that would happen. Is it some genetic thing? Is it some exposure to a virus that then causes the immune system to overreact and kind of kill off the nerve cells or do something funny there? We don't know that. Another type of psychotic disorder. Have you heard of schizoaffective disorder, anyone? That's a different one, kind of. I think of that as kind of a cross between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, or depression. So if a person has schizophrenia-like symptoms, so there are times when their mood is normal, but they get psychotic and they have these delusions or hallucinations, but their mood is normal. That could be schizophrenia, right? Well, now let's say they have a lot of mood problems, though. They have a lot of depressions intermixed in with their schizophrenia. If they just have like one episode of depression and then over 5 years and the rest of the time it just looks like schizophrenia, that's probably not schizoaffective disorder. If they have 2 or 3 or 4 episodes of some kind of mood problem, whether that be mania or depression or both, then it's like a cross between a mood disorder and schizophrenia, and we call that schizoaffective disorder. The only reason that makes a lot of difference is because of the way we treat it. So folks like that, let's say it's bipolar type symptoms, it's mania and depression, and then a lot of the psychosis, those folks would probably be treated a little bit differently, maybe with a mood stabilizing medicine in addition to an antipsychotic medicine. Okay? So that's the main difference. And I just wanted to cover it just because you may hear that at some point, and that way at least I've done it justice. One that's really, really interesting that I want to spend a little more time on is called delusional disorder. The reason this is so interesting is because it makes a psychiatrist's life very difficult with this disorder. Folks will come into your office and they'll tell you this big, elaborate story about something that's going on, and you're right with them. You're following there, and you're like, okay, I can see where that would happen. I can see where that would happen. I can see where that happened. And then the spouse comes in, next session or whatever. None of this has ever happened. And yeah, he had some trouble with it. And I'll give you some examples, but it's basically a non-bizarre delusion. It's something that's believable, but it isn't true. It isn't happening. And the only way you know that is to get history from someone else. And usually you need more than one person, because what if the spouse is really just wanting to get this person out of their life, and so they're making all this up? You can't just trust one other person. You really need to kind of get some history from the other folks in the environment, boss or spouse or some other folks. But these delusions are, again, they're thoughts. They're commonly like paranoia or something like that. And this person really thinks this stuff is happening. It's their reality, okay? But it just isn't happening. The behavior's not odd, like in schizophrenia. It's not the same thing. These folks, like I said, their behavior's kind of different. Their speech is sometimes different. And these folks, I mean, it's like you or me walking around out there. It's just that when you talk to them, all they talk about, they are just focused and fixed, and it's so pervasive, this thought, or whatever it is, this idea, this scheme, or whatever's going on around them. They don't usually have hallucinations. It's not common for them to hear things or see things that go along with these things. Now, what are these types, okay? Have you heard of erotomanic? That's kind of a fancy word, but erotomanic delusional disorder. You guys remember when Letterman was getting stalked? Remember that, David Letterman, Remember that woman that was constantly going out? I think, it's somewhere I read, I think that she probably had erotomanic disorder. This is where a person thinks that somebody, usually somebody of higher stature, whatever that means, is in love with them, or that they're meant to be together. It's the destiny and everything to be together. And these folks will go to no end. I mean, they'll stop at nothing to be with this person. Even though this person looks them right in the eye or gets a restraining order or whatever, they don't get the idea. They don't get the message that, look, like Letterman did, I don't want you coming across into my property. That's erotomanic disorder. I've seen that a couple times in my practice. And it's tough because you cannot, no matter how much you rationalize and reason with this, look at this is a restraining order. They're taking you to court. Now we're in court because of this. You must not call them anymore. But I'm sure we're supposed to be together. I'm going to call them tonight. You know, I mean, they do. They break their restraint and they end up in jail sometimes. It's a very difficult thing. Grandiose type of delusional disorder is sort of like we talked about it. It's not so bad as, it's not odd like, you know, thinking you're Jesus Christ, but somehow feeling that you have a special relationship with God, or that you're a famous person, or, you know, that there's something very, very special about you. A jealous type. This is where, and I've had several cases of this too, this is fairly common. I think the most common ones are erotomanic, paranoid, and jealous type. Jealous type is, my spouse or significant other is having an affair, I absolutely know it. And I've seen this evidence, and that evidence, and this evidence, and that evidence, and I swear I saw her driving down, you know, this is a 60-some-year-old man, I swear I saw her riding in the back of a Harley with this guy down through town. And I saw stains in her underwear, and I saw this, and I saw that, and I see, you know, all these things, you know, and completely obsessed with it. Could not get it off of his mind, you know, and it can happen with women too. But you really, and then once you treat it, it's still, again, like I said, you use the medicine. They're not talking about it all the time anymore when they come to see you. But if you ask, yeah, I know, that still ticks me off that she had that affair with that guy. You know? But I don't think she's having it now because I don't see any evidence anymore that it's occurring. You know, so they still hold on to the thought that it's happening. And let me tell you, that's tough on a spouse, as you can imagine. I mean, they think, boy, you know, this person is, you know, I mean, I can't breathe, because they smother them. Persecutory type. I'll give you another example. This is a couple examples of this one. This is one where the person is convinced that somebody's out to hurt them in some way, or their family in some way. Okay? One case I saw when I was a resident, I was at Lewis Carter Hospital doing a rotation. This was early on. I'll never forget this case. It was kind of an interesting. It was a middle-aged lady who had a 19-year-old daughter, and her daughter had attended a party where there were parents. The young girl whose parents, I mean, where this one girl had a party, okay, and invited this girl, this patient's daughter. Well, unfortunately, at this party, this girl fell down the concrete steps, had a massive head injury, and died. Okay, and of course that's a major shock to lose your child, right? But this woman, I think she got depressed at first, and then she just started this delusion started to develop, and near as we can tell, it was a delusion from all the police and everybody else that were involved. That the parents, or that this family had set this up to kill this girl, and had set it up so they could push her down the stairs and kill her. She was so distraught about this, and this went on, I guess, for like a year or something. She wasn't getting much treatment because it hadn't, you know, the family, I guess, was worried about it, but they didn't bring her into any treatment. Well, she happened to see these folks, some members of this family that she was so focused on, having hurt her daughter, see them coming out of a restaurant in a rearview mirror after she had just come out, put her car in reverse and slammed on the accelerator and ran over some person of this family. Okay, obviously she went to jail for that, and then went before a judge, and the judge said, "You're not competent to stand trial. You can't understand what's going on here," you know, because she was obviously fairly delusional. So they sent her to Lewis Carter for us to try to treat her so that she could understand, you know, how to help in her own defense and things like that. We couldn't shake it. We could not shake that delusion, no matter what kind of treatment. And part of it is, too, she didn't want any treatment. She didn't think there was anything wrong with her. At first she was depressed, and then we were able to treat the depression, but she still was very delusional about this, and we couldn't, there was nothing we could do. And of course I don't know what happened, because I rotated off, you know, and went to a different rotation at that point. But interesting case. One other case was a gentleman who, I mean, this kind of stuff could happen to any of us, right? He's working and he sees his coworker do something that was really unethical, or shouldn't have been doing. I don't know what it was. And he sort of spoke to the supervisor about it, you know, maybe narked him out, I don't know. But, you know, he spoke to the supervisor about it. The guy got in some trouble, and he found out that this guy had turned him in. This guy, he threatened this, you know, the guy that got in trouble sort of threatened the patient and said, you know, I'm going to get, or you'll get yours, or something like that. I mean, he didn't do anything, he didn't wave any guns in his face, he didn't beat him up or any of that, but just a verbal threat in some way. And then that was really about it, as far as we can tell. But this gentleman started worrying that stuff was in, you know, like somebody had broken into his locker and put chemicals in his clothes, and he'd be itching all over, and thought somebody had broken into this guy, you know, had broken into his truck and sabotaged some things. And he became so focused on this guy and started thinking that this guy was hiring people to follow him all over. he would be up all night. He'd look out the window. He'd see, he lived on kind of a highway, and he'd look to see, and there'd be cars driving by slow. You know, of course, he lived in it was sort of picture 40. I don't know where it was, but picture 40, like Highway 40. You know, like coming into a small town where you got to slow down. So all these cars would slow down right by his house, and he was assuming, okay, they're slowing down because they're looking at me, they're spying on me, you know, that kind of thing. Convinced that they were going to hurt him someday, he worked real early in the morning, so he'd leave his house in the dark. He would not turn his lights on his car on. He would drive down these country roads at 90 miles an hour because he didn't want anybody following him. He wanted to get away from him, he'd get out there before they could find him. So he was driving with his lights off at 4 in the morning, you know, really fast down these country roads. I forget how he came into treatment. I mean, a spouse or somebody brought him into treatment, but I could not shake it. I mean, the guy, with the medicine, you know, we were finally able to get him to calm down some, but he wouldn't stay on the medicine. He didn't think there was a problem. He thought it was all in this guy. I mean, this went on for 4 years, by the way. So I would point out to him, okay, if this man was going to hurt you, why would he spend all the money it would take to hire all these people to follow you and trace you all over the place? That would cost a lot. That would cost a fortune. Why would he do that? Why wouldn't he just get it over with and hurt you? Maybe that wasn't a good thing to say. I don't know. But, you know, he didn't have an answer for that, but he was still convinced this guy was doing it. He even ended up going to Texas to run away from the guy. Of course, the guy followed him, right? Because it was not really a guy doing it. So, fascinating illness. Kind of sad, but fascinating. I think that the way I think of these things, it's a problem in some of the pathways of the brain. We'll kind of get into that in a minute as to what might be causing these things. One other sort of fascinating psychotic illness is called folie à deux. It's shared psychosis, and I've seen this once in my again, this was in residency as well. Lou Carter seems to be it was a good place to see different things that you wouldn't see everywhere else. This is where someone has a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia or something. Usually it's a family member, you know. Then a dependent family member, typically dependent family member, gets caught up in the psychosis and believes the whole thing. Okay. The case I saw was a woman, an adult woman, mother who probably had schizophrenia, and she had a daughter who was deaf. And for some reason, by the way, sensory impairment of some type, you know, blindness, deafness, things like that, they set folks up for these delusions, delusional disorder and psychotic disorders. I don't know why. I think maybe because they're not, the rest of us, we have lots of different ways to tell what's real and what isn't, right? Now, if you take one of our senses away, you know, maybe that makes it harder for us to tell what's real and what isn't. One of the erotomanic type cases I was just talking about a minute ago was a woman who was deaf. And actually, it's interesting because I didn't know this at the time when I was treating her, but I was reading about the disorder, and it even mentions in the literature, it mentions that folks that have deafness or blindness or some sensory problem are at higher risk for these things. So anyway, back to this shared psychosis, this daughter was very dependent on mom, partly because she was deaf, I would imagine, and so mom kept her in the house and wouldn't let her go out much or go around other people much. So the psychosis that mom had directly affected the daughter, and the daughter basically grew up thinking this is reality. Isn't that kind of interesting? So her reality was her mother's psychosis. So they both had the same psychosis, although the girl was probably not really, she's not the one that had the schizophrenia, it was the mother. So the way you treat that, and this worked to some extent, it was difficult because it was hard to get them apart, but you have to separate them in some way. And then treat the mother's illness, and do what you can, to try to bring the daughter or the other person back into reality. And it worked a little bit. It wasn't, of course, I again rotated off before I got to see the total effect. Now it was difficult too because we had a hard time communicating. This little girl, she wasn't a little girl, she was a teenager, but she couldn't sign language. She didn't do sign language because mom had isolated her. And they had this almost like their own little language that they would use back and forth. And of course, none of us knew that. We couldn't relate to it. It was kind of fascinating. So that's shared psychosis. Now, I told you that this could happen to any of us. So I'm assuming that you now realize that there's got to be something in all of our brains that that makes it so that we could that makes it so that we could have this, but also makes it so that there must be something in there that when we're not psychotic that keeps us from being psychotic. So there must be some type of brain pathway that that keeps these things from happening. You know, probably all of you have experienced a time where a thought will pop into your head, and it's a weird, kind of a weird thought, right? But you're able to sort of say, "Oh, that was weird," and kind of go on and not focus so much on it. My thought is, or my theory is, and some other folks agree, that maybe there's whatever is responsible for us to be able to put that aside and focus on something else. That part of the brain isn't working right, maybe, and these folks are not able to sort of sort out all this extraneous information that we are able to sort out. So it's possible that that could be what's going on, but suffice it to say, I mean, it's obviously a brain thing, right? It's not coming from your heart or your kidneys or anything else, right? It's coming from your brain. And if you think about it, I mean, we take these things for granted, but all of us have some sense of reality. We walk around, I'm looking at you guys, I see you sitting out there, you see me standing up here. I mean, we know that, okay, this is reality, and we have some way of doing that. Our brain does that for us some way. We don't think consciously about it, it just happens. But those things occur in the brain, and those different things might be something, might be what's causing this psychosis. If there's a wiring problem or a chemical imbalance, you know, we in the old days, or even now still, we talk about chemical imbalances, right? That's pretty simplistic. I mean, the brain isn't just a bunch of chemicals, right? There's a whole bunch of things that go on in the brain besides just chemicals. But one of the simple theories about these things, and what does happen, like with certain drugs, for instance, is that there are some chemicals. There's one chemical in particular. Anybody ever heard of dopamine? Dopamine is one chemical that's in the brain, and there are different pathways, different series or connection circuits, I guess is the right word, circuits that use a lot of dopamine in the brain. Okay, one of those, in one of those particular parts, there's too much dopamine going around. Okay, remember me saying that maybe those nerve cells didn't develop out like they should, so they held back, and there's too many of them in one spot. There's too much dopamine in that part of the brain. That we think that's what's causing the psychosis in some folks. Okay, now you can also probably deduce that now. So you're saying, Doc, that okay, they have too much dopamine in that part of the brain. What about the part that you said where the nerve cells didn't grow out far enough in the frontal parts of the brain? Well, if you remember, what do the frontal parts of your brain do? They're what allow us to judge things, to organize things, to plan things. They're what sort of make us different than animals, right? Mice don't do much planning ahead. I mean, they do a little, but not a whole lot, right? So animals don't do that as much. We can, and that's because of our frontal lobes. We think that these nerve cells, that's causing some of the problem with schizophrenia. These folks not being able to plan, can't go to the grocery and figure out what they need for the week and things like that, because those nerve cells didn't make it where they should have. So there's not enough up here in the frontal part, and there's too much deeper in. There are other, dopamine's another, it's kind of interesting too, that there's a part of your brain that controls movement. And you guys have heard of Parkinson's disease, right? Okay, now, what I've always found fascinating is that if you give, Parkinson's disease basically is where one of these circuits, one of these movement circuits that uses dopamine, these nerve cells are dying off. Like in Michael J. Fox, they're dying off earlier than they should. Obviously shouldn't be dying off in a guy that age. Something is killing them off, we don't know what. But when he loses those nerve cells, he loses the dopamine. And what happens? He shuffles, he shakes, he can't, his movement is all out of whack, right? He's very slow in his movements. And I don't know if you've seen interviews recently with him, but you notice that he can't sit still. He's moving all over the place, So this is because of the Parkinson's disease. Now, how do you treat that? You give the person dopamine. That's one thing you can do. There's a medicine, Cinemet, and there's some other medicines like that. They basically are, Cinemet in particular, is dopamine. So you're giving that to the person, that's going into the brain, and it's treating those movement problems that he's having to some extent. Now realize he's losing the nerve cells, right? If you lose the nerve cells, I don't care how much dopamine you give, there's nothing there for it to work on, right? So that's the problem with his illness. That's why we can't fully cure it. But let's say, for example, you give too much dopamine to somebody with Parkinson's. What do you suppose happens? Remember I said there's other circuits in the brain that use dopamine, one of which can make folks psychotic. So some folks with Parkinson's disease, if you give them too much dopamine, they'll become psychotic. They'll start to hallucinate. They'll start to hear things and see things. So it's almost like there's this happy medium that you have to reach. You got to give enough dopamine for the Parkinson's to treat it, but not so much that you make them psychotic. Now let's turn the tables for a second. Let's talk about schizophrenia. We just said that this is an example of a person who has too much dopamine in a different circuit of their brain, right? So let's try to block that. And that's what a lot of these medicines do, okay? Especially the older medicines are real strong at doing that. And the newer medicines, they still do it. I mean, you kind of have to block dopamine to some extent to treat the psychosis. Well, now, I just told you that blocking dopamine, like what if you didn't have enough dopamine? So what if you gave too much medicine and you blocked a lot of dopamine in the part of the brain that controls movement? Because you can't, the medicines at this point, we can't just go to one particular circuit in the brain and that's it and not affect anything else. Sometimes if you're going to block dopamine, you're going to block it in different areas too. And one of the parts you might block it is the part that controls movement. What is that going to look like? It's going to look like Parkinson's disease, right? But you're not killing the nerve cell. That's the good news. So as you stop the medicine, and the Parkinson's symptoms will go away. So this person, we could make somebody look exactly like Michael J. Fox if we gave too much of a medicine to treat schizophrenia, let's say. So you have to walk this fine line between treating the psychosis but not causing something like Parkinson's or some type of movement problem, okay? So keep in mind, if somebody's getting treatment for schizophrenia or some type of psychotic disorder with one of these types of medicines, and they start to look like they have Parkinson's disease, you got to make sure that it's not the medicine first. I've seen that in my practice quite a bit. I do a lot of geriatric psychiatry, and a lot of times there are medicines that the docs will give for, let's say they give them an antipsychotic medicine, something to treat psychosis, and then the person, because they're 65, 67, 70 years old, they start to have Parkinson's symptoms, and the doctor may say, geez, now they're developing Parkinson's disease. And I've seen that happen where a person gets diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Well, it really is not Parkinson's, it's the medicine, it's a side effect. So you have to that's why I'm kind of talking about this, is so that if you ever know folks or take care of folks, some of you guys take care of folks out there, if they get started on antipsychotic medicine, then you got to make sure that that's not what's causing the Parkinson's disease. And those aren't the only types of medicines. There are some common medicines that we use for nausea that block dopamine in the brain. So has anybody ever heard of Phenergan or Compazine, Reglan? Have you heard of Reglan? Those medicines all block dopamine in the brain. And I've seen on more than one occasion where folks will get, usually it's older folks. You guys are mostly young out here. So you guys, if you were to take a little Compazine or Phenergan or something, most of you are not going to have any trouble at all. Probably all of you. None of you will have any trouble. But let's say you're 80 years old and you took a little too much Compazine or something. That person might end up looking like they have Parkinson's disease or something like that. So I won't go into much more depth, I guess, about all the side effects and all the medicines and all that stuff. I need to leave it open for some questions. And I don't know if there are any questions or not. If not, I'm going to show you this website for this YouTube thing so that everybody can check that out if they want to. Because I cover so much in here, it's kind of hard to take it all in and remember it all that. So if you ever wanted to learn something about it, and these things, once they get on there, I assume they'll stay on there. I don't know if anybody will take it off. So I'll show you that. I don't remember if this is the right direction for this slash here, so if it's not, try it the other way. But it's just www.you2.com, and then a slash. It's a brain thing, with no spaces or any kind of punctuation. And that should take you right to, I set it up so that should take you right to all my videos. And I've got, there are quite a few of them on there now, but some of them are, in the early days I had to break them into like 10 minutes chunks. So bipolar disorder is like 6 parts, and dementia there's one on Alzheimer's disease, and other types of dementia is like 8 parts. The later ones then are about a half an hour each, and this one will probably be. Any questions for me on any of this stuff?
I have one.
Yes.
I have a family member that's experienced schizophrenic.
Yes.
And like you said, with the FBI and all that, do you just play along with that so you don't make them mad? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get that question a lot. And I sort of alluded to that a minute ago, and I meant to say more about it, and I forgot. The question was, and I'll repeat it for here, but the question was with someone who suffers from paranoid schizophrenia and has a delusion of some type, and this, like the example I used was the FBI being out to get them in some way. The question is, how does the family deal with that? Do you go along with the delusion, or do you challenge the delusion and try to point out, well, I don't think that's very realistic. I don't think that could happen, that kind of thing. I don't think it's very. Once you know it's psychosis, I guess in the beginning, nobody's going to fault you for challenging them or trying to show them that maybe that's not the case. But if they refuse to believe otherwise, and they start to get a little upset with you about it, back off. By all means, back off, because these folks will get kind of agitated, and you don't want that to happen. So certainly, when I'm practicing and seeing somebody, I don't want to lead them on and say, well, yeah, oh yeah, I saw that, yeah, I saw that. I don't want to say, I'm going to lie like that, but I will say, geez, that must be really uncomfortable, you know. Can we talk? Let me help you through that. Let me talk to you about that for a second. You know, tell me more, or whatever, you know. Sometimes distraction's another good thing. Like, you know, saying something like, oh, that's, you know, that must be terrible to feel like somebody's out to get you. You know, one time I felt like that. And then sort of segue into something else about, you know, hey, you know, you hungry? Let's go get something to eat, you know, or something like that. And you distract the person. With psychosis, though, if they're getting very sick and they're getting, you know, very psychotic, it's very difficult to distract them into something else. So, you know, and when it comes to that point, it's probably time to call the doctor and say, look, I think we're having some trouble here. Usually, you'll have some you know, kind of risk factors for them to get worse. So, usually, the most common thing is they start to get stressed a little bit, and then when they get not a little bit, but usually it's, you know, it can be quite a little bit of stress, and it gets a little bigger, a little more, and then they start to lose sleep. That's a key. They start to lose sleep, and then they start getting really psychotic. So those are sort of warning signs. One other thing is that there was a study done once with folks with schizophrenia, and they looked at their family lives at home, and they found that that a lot of negatively expressed emotion in the home was equated to a lot worse illness. So these folks that lived in homes where there's lots of yelling and screaming and fighting and challenge, I would assume maybe challenging, I don't know. I mean, I think what would happen is if you challenge the person on the delusion, what I've seen is they get kind of agitated and angry, right? And then sometimes folks don't realize why are they getting angry, then they get angry back, you know, and it gets this huge fight kind of thing. Well, these folks, you know, those folks that are in environments like that, they don't do very well. I mean, even with medicine and all, they don't seem to stay well for very long. So I always told folks when I was treating patients, I always want the family to come in with me. And, you know, number one, you got to try to make sure they take their medicine and stay in seeing me, and, you know, try to, you know, you can't be perfect, but encourage them not to use drugs or other things that are going to make them worse. But also, you know, try to keep it kind of calm and even keel at home. Don't be so tense and, you know, yelling and screaming and things like that, because that stuff's going to make the illness worse. So did that answer the question? Okay. It's a good question, and I get that a lot, actually. The same thing happens with folks in nursing homes and things that have dementia and, yeah, I mean, I guess dementia is the most common thing, but they'll start, if they have psychosis or a delusion of some type, you don't want to say, you know, there's no basement here. There's nobody in the basement here. There's nobody talking to you. You know, you don't want to say things that, you know, you want to say things that are more kind of reassuring, but not challenging, I guess, is the way to put it. Other questions?
What's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
That's a great one. I get that one a lot. Dementia sort of is like a kind of a broad term. So there's dementia, and there's all kinds of dementias. There's Alzheimer's disease is one type. And then there's like Lewy body disease and vascular dementia. So there's different kinds of dementia. Dementia just sort of means the symptoms, like, and what it is, you know, it's memory problems, it's difficulty finding words, you know, it's basically an illness where the person's losing brain cells for some reason. You know, in Alzheimer's it's one reason, and vascular disease it's stroke, and so on. So dementia is sort of the broad term, and then there's all different types of dementia under that. I'm trying to think of another example medically. Can anybody think of another example? I'm trying to think. Like diabetes, and then there's type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Is that, that's not a great example, I guess, but I'm trying to think of another one. Anyways, did that answer that? Does that make sense?
No, not really.
Not so much? Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Let me try to help out a little better. So dementia is when we say dementia, we talk about there's certain symptoms that somebody would have with dementia, okay? And if you have Alzheimer's disease, you might have all those symptoms. If you have vascular disease, you might have all those symptoms too. So no matter what's causing it, dementia is a certain cluster of symptoms. It just means the person has these symptoms, okay? And then you got to figure out what's causing it. And if you can figure out what kind, that's basically what I mean by that, is what type of dementia is it? Have they had lots of strokes? That might be vascular dementia. Have they had, do they have a lot of Parkinson's type symptoms with it? It might be Lewy body dementia, okay? Or do they have, has it been a slow, kind of a gradual thing that's gone on over a couple of years? They've slowly lost short-term memory, and then it's gotten a little worse, and the personalities change, and so on. That would maybe be more like an Alzheimer's dementia, okay? So Alzheimer's, maybe the one thing would help is if you called it Alzheimer's dementia, or vascular dementia, or Lewy body dementia. There's all these different kinds of dementia. Dementia is just the symptoms, and the type is the actual name, like Alzheimer's. Okay, that's about the best I can do. We can talk afterwards. I can try to do a little better, but that's a tough one. A lot of folks, that's a very common one for folks to ask. I think it's a confusing one for people. Any other questions? Hey, thanks for coming in. You guys have been great. Hardly anybody fell asleep. That's great. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next month, maybe. Okay, so there were a couple of kind of important points that I forgot to mention in this talk tonight on psychosis and psychotic disorders. I guess the first of which is that you have to be aware that the more time somebody has a psychotic break, the more psychotic breaks they have, I should say, in the course of their illness, the worse the illness is. So the worse these episodes are, the longer they last, the harder they are to treat. They don't respond as well to medication, and it seems like there may be something going on in the brain that's getting worse. Maybe some kind of process that's actually damaging the brain in some way. So the concern is that you've got to jump on the treatment of these illnesses and get them under control and into remission as quickly as you possibly can. Avoid stress, negatively expressed emotion, like I mentioned with the question earlier. And in addition, you also need to be, besides staying on the medicine and besides, trying to keep this in remission, another thing you can do is make sure that the person, if you have a family member that has a psychotic illness, such as one of these that we discussed tonight, make sure that they try to make sure, if you can, that they do not imbibe in illicit drugs, alcohol, things like that. All of these things can affect the brain and make it more likely that the person will have a relapse into another psychotic episode. And of course, like I just mentioned, if the more that they have, the worse this illness becomes. I've had cases where folks, they thought, well, drinking is not going to hurt me, or smoking some pot is not going to hurt me. And unfortunately, these folks' illnesses would continue to get worse despite my best efforts at treatment. So I guess I thought those points were important enough to bring out that I wanted to add those tonight. So that's the end of the talk for tonight, and I guess I'll see everyone next month when we discuss substance abuse. Thank you very much.